Hello. So I wanted to talk about something I noticed about the way a lot of contemporary jazz guitarists like Lagerlund and Peter Bernstein approach altered dominance. And relates to, I think, some quite sort of old currents in jazz. But I would say on the whole, the movement in jazz harmony has been to go from playing quite tonal sounds, which really have a lot of movement in them, to playing more floating sounds. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, a very moving sound, a standard bit of tonal movement we're likely to come across in Western music from the 1600s on is this, which is simply a 5-1. It's G7 going to C. Now, most theorists say that the thing that drives that is this unstable interval here, the tritone between F and B, which wants to resolve in this key into E and C, which is the two most important notes of the C triad. In this case, it's a contraction with the inversion, right? In this case, it's an expansion, right? Okay, now, of course, we could also resolve to another key, which is F, for instance. F sharp. But those tritones have a strong desire to resolve, and jazz inherited this language. Now, I think it's possible to sort of rate a lot of chords on a scale of how hungry they are, and generally how hungry they are is how many tritones they've got in it. So, like a C major chord isn't very hungry, and neither is a C minor seventh. But what is a bit hungry is a C7, and a C minor sixth is a hungry chord too. It can resolve like that. Also a half diminished chord, same thing. Yeah, there's a tritone in it. Now you have super hungry chords that have two tritones in, such as the diminished seventh, which is super resolving, right? Okay. Another one would be the 7 sharp 11 or 7 flat 5 chord. Right? Very hungry. Okay? If that makes any sense to you. The hungriest scale is probably the whole tone scale. And the least hungry scale is probably the pentatonic, which doesn't contain any tritones at all. Okay. On the other hand, you have the major scale has one tritone, so it's just that. But the melodic minor has two tritones in it. It's like this. Got those two tritones there, right? Right. So those two tritones make for hungrier harmony in the melodic minor, and one manifestation of this that most of us use would be the altered scale, which is what you would build on a G7. It can be understood as being an A-flat melodic minor scale on G7. Or the seventh mode of that particular scale. That has two tritones in, which is where you get this chord. Right? Looking at it from a chord scale perspective, there are other ways to look at dominant, altered dominant chords, but I'm going to focus on the altered scale today, just because that will give me enough to make a video about. Now, I just want to go a little bit back to Lester Young, who I think was the first one to start, probably not the first one, but to my mind, I think of him as the first one in my sort of private jazz mythology, to start weakening that kind of tonal hold into something a bit more floating. So what I mean by that is, instead of playing something like this, I might play something like this. So the difference between those two things, the first thing I've just played a G7 into C, and the second one I played an F minor into C. Now F minor doesn't have that leading tone, that B, which helps set up the tritone. It's a much softer sound. Okay, it doesn't have that kind of yada, and that B is the third of the G7. So what I'm talking about really is just removing the B. Okay. Now this is quite a big thing. So I mean, a lot of bebop lines have lots and lots of tritones in them. It's kind of one of the distinguishing features of the style. But as jazz went on, I think people got a little bit tired of that. And of course, part of the modal movement was to take it away from such busy, constantly resolving chord progressions. And from modal music, we got into post-tonal or post-functional jazz, like you hear with Wayne Shorter, and then later on with the fusion movement, and now moving forward into contemporary jazz in the present day. So I'd say the last 50 or 60 years of jazz progress has been moving perhaps towards more floating sounds. And the most floating sounds you've got are generally based on consonant intervals. I mean, there would be, so not tritones, but fourths, fifths, maybe sixths and thirds, although they can be a little closed, and I think people generally prefer more floating ambiguous harmonies, although triads are quite widely used, and maybe even major seconds. Okay, so that produces a different palette of sounds. Now, if I was just to take something relatively restful, which would be triads, like our Lester Young example, for instance, going F minor. This isn't necessarily the kind of line that Lester Young would play. Lester Young might play something more like this. But it has the same function. Okay? You hear things like this from Charlie Christian, from Charlie Parker, Lester Young. That sense of just not hammering the B in the key of C, or the leading note in any key, the seventh, is, I think, part of the harmonic palette. Lester does do this, but he does it less, and it kind of gives his playing more of a floating quality. Now, moving forward towards altered chords, let's just do a couple of hip substitutions on the D minor and the E. Now, we're going to keep it simple. So I'm going to play an F major on the D minor seventh, on the say 2 chord. I'm going to play an E minor on a C, right? Those sound particularly good. Now, on the G7 chord, I could just play G, but that's kind of boring. You'll hear what I mean. Dull, right? So one thing we could do to make that altered sound is we could use a major triad from the altered scale. So the altered scale, in this case G altered, or A flat melodic minor, actually contains 2 major triads, and one of them is a D flat and one of them is an E flat, right? We're going to take the D flat, and this is a very common understood relationship between the G7 and the D flat. Now, Barry Harris fans are going to be a bit annoyed about all of this chord scale talk. I apologise. In Barry Harris's understanding, it would simply be a tritone substitute. And actually, this is a thing that you see all the time in bebop lines. Players will play, for instance, Hank Mobley, or whoever you can think of, will play D minor, D flat major into C major. So you get this kind of thing, right? Very bebop-y, actually, right? But it can also sound quite contemporary as well. Now, the other thing that I often hear people like Lage and Lund do is they will add notes to an arpeggio, so they'll turn it into a 4-note arpeggio, or what Stephen Harris and Jordan Clemens might call a quadrad. So, for instance, in the case of D flat, I've heard Lage and Lund add a sharp 4 to it. That certainly adds a certain mystery to it. Now, if we could do the same thing for our F. So let's try that. So that gives us a little bit more to play with, a little bit more contemporary sound. However, I think what is a more contemporary choice, at least to my ears, in terms of the major triads, is the E flat. Listen to this. I'm going to play F, E flat, and then E minor, right? Has a certain vibe to it, I think. I play its voicing. Yeah, right? Again. So that's another choice. Now, in the case of Stephen Harris or Jordan Clemens, they would add an extra note to it, which would be maybe the actual third of the chord. But I don't want to do that here because I feel that's getting away from our... So they'd add like, the B. Nothing wrong with that, but I think that kind of brings us back into the realm of having the tritone in there, and that's what I've been trying to get away from. So you could just add a natural fourth in instead. Let's try that. And notice I'm adding a extra note to the E minor as well. I'm adding this note here, which from the point of view of C is a 13th, but from the point of view of the E minor triad is again a fourth, right? So adding fourths to things works quite nicely. Now there's also the minor triad. Perhaps the most obvious one is A flat minor, because A flat melodic minor is G altered. Let's try that. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a bit... It's kind of, doing the right place, but it's kind of a bit, not in Tunisia. This is a very common bebop choice. If it wants to be a bit more contemporary, perhaps the B flat minor might be more unusual. Okay. Now, what I've heard Peter Bernstein, Tim Miller, quite a few musicians do is to take the B flat minor and turn it into a pentatonic. We can do this because there's only one minor pentatonic that fits into the melodic minor scale, and that's the minor pentatonic you can build in the second degree. So the second mode of the melodic minor is, I think, usually referred to as B flat Dorian flat 9, right? So it's like a Dorian mode with the flat ninth in it. But that flat 9 doesn't affect that pentatonic framework because the pentatonic scale doesn't have a ninth in. So that works absolutely fine. Now, an interesting thing about the B flat minor pentatonic, is that it relates to the D flat major pentatonic. And the D flat major pentatonic is simply what you might build on the flat 5 substitute of the G7, on the tritone substitute. So we've already talked about the D flat triad, but the D flat pentatonic, major pentatonic, is just a development of that. So again, it's like you can build... Obviously, you can build like fourth voicings or fourthy sorts of voices. Like that, that's fun to play around with. You can also put things with seconds in. That's quite fun too. So if I do the same thing down a step for D minor, I'm basically, using those two, and then I can use E minor pentatonic for the C. So it sounds a bit like this. Into E minor at the end, right? So that's a nice sound. That's very, I think, safe to say, very floating, very contemporary. And of course, part of the reason why it sounds so floating and so contemporary is because the pentatonic scales by their very nature just have no sort of funny intervals or anything in. They're super euphonious, provided you think of the fourth and the second as being a euphonious interval, which I think most jazzers do. This is not considered to be a dissonant, but rather a different kind of consonance. so it kind of gives you a different character. We've still got some of that functionality, but the functionality's been softened in the same way that Lester Young did. And of course, Lester Young also favoured the pentatonic scale all that time ago. So perhaps we can draw a line from like Lester Young to McCoy Tyner, who is a great pentatonic player, into contemporary jazz. I don't know. There's probably more to it than that, but it seems like that seems to be something that happened. So let's just do this again then. You might wonder actually why I didn't use the B minor, which is a nice thing on the C major. So let me just go up. There's a Tim Miller lesson where he does this. You just go up from the A minor. It gives you a Lydian sound on the C. Have a listen to this. Do it with the voicings as well. And I feel like the Lydian is kind of... It's just a strong sound in its own right. I don't really want to use it all the time. The E minor has the interesting sort of upper extensions of that chord. But it doesn't take you too far away from that, you know, essentially major key sort of world. So, you know... You know, you still have that, you're not necessarily putting it into that sharp 11th sort of world, but you can do that if you want. There's obviously nothing wrong with that. So, with that in mind, well, that's basically it. I mean, there's other sounds you can use, like Lage Lund in his one of his videos uses a major ninth sound. So, I mean, we could do something like perhaps different inversions. We could play the F major on the D, and then play, you know, that's the first inversion, major ninth chord on the B, which works on the G, right? So the reason why that works is because there's one major ninth chord in the melodic minor on the third degree. So in this case it's on B, because that's the third degree of A flat melodic minor, or C flat if you want to be super pedantic. But that has no fifth in it, and if we were to use a fifth, we'd have to use a raised fifth, like that, which takes us back to that E flat triad, by the way, with a B in the bass. So that sound is, you know, kind of cool. But in this case we're just omitting the fifth, doing that. We've got different inversions, or that shape, depending on how you play it. Okay, and we can just take those inversions and just run them into each other. So I think this is quite nice. We go like that. We'll do it with the bass notes. I wish I'd given myself more of a run up in that one. Stretchy dial. There you go. Hours of fun. So I think there's some mileage in that. I think, like, again, voicings for altered dominance. There's a really nice one that's like this. It's like a kind of more, I suppose, if I did a flat 13, it'd be more of an altered one. But this is with the natural 13, it's kind of more of a 13 flat 9 sound. It's pretty easy to play up here. But that voicing has no third in it. Another voicing I like is this for a 7 flat 9. It's just root 7th, flat 7th, flat 9th. Do a flat 9 which happens to look like a minor 7th chord. And in fact, actually, I could play, you know, the half diminished, but I mean, I probably wouldn't because that's got a tritone in it. But you could play like G half diminished as a way of getting into C major, and that again belongs to the altered scale, so that's another route through. But I encourage you to sort of think about this sort of stuff. It can give you a way of like creating more floating music out of traditional changes. For instance, there's a tune on an album that I'm going to put out any decade now, which is based on Out of Nowhere, and I simply just took the first two chords and just sort of reharmonised them with major 7th chords, you know. And in this case, I'm not using the altered scale or any melodic minor modes. I'm just, the first chord is G major 7th. It's out of nowhere, so I'm going to use this sort of nice voicing, which is a sort of D major triad over a G. Very open, and then I'm going to take the flat 7 sub on the E flat and use a D flat major 7th. So right, so you get this non-functional movement out of what was originally, an unusual movement, but a tonal one anyway. It's an augmented sixth relationship. If I go, or it's called the augmented sixth, which you get a lot in classical music. But to do that to me is a kind of an interesting sound, So you can take these, very simple progressions and turn them into something a little bit more interesting, if that's what you want to do. I mean, I'm sure all the beboppers would be cross at me for doing that. So if I was to take a minor 2-5-1, for instance, again. Or something, it's just a way of breaking things up, and I think that's the way modern players and modern musicians have used them. And it's quite fun to sort of be able to slip from your hypertonal, kind of bebop thing to something a bit more. Something a little bit more, a little bit more floating. It's another colour you can use. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think and post any comments below as always. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.